Intel just revealed yesterday in their earnings call that they are pretty much being annihilated by the competition, meaning like AMD, NVIDIA, TSMC chip manufacturer. It was in their earnings call. They talked about how their 7-nanometer chips are delayed until at least 2022. Meanwhile, AMD is already putting out 7-nanometer chips by this year. They already announced the Ryzen 4000, for example. So let's read through this article first on The Verge. We can quickly go through, then we'll talk about the difference between 7 and 10 nanometer. I'm not an expert. I pretty much took a crash course while reading through these articles, so I'll try to explain it in the best way that I can. But let's see what we say. Intel finally got its 10-nanometer chips out on the market after years of delays, but now the company has announced that it's encountered issues with its upcoming 7-nanometer process that will result in delays for the next generation of chips too. As Intel's Q2 2020 earnings release notes, the company's 7-nanometer based CPU product timing is shifting approximately 6 months relative to prior expectations, pushing them back from an originally planned arrival of the end of 2021. So even originally they were saying end of 2021, now it's 6-month delay, and it's saying this 6-month delay would push that date into at least 2022, if not further, due to what Intel CEO Bob Swan referred to as a defect mode in the 7-nanometer process, according to Tom's Hardware. Intel actually says that the issue with the current 7-nanometer process means the production is trending a year behind its internal roadmap. For some reason, though, the company says that being a year behind schedule will only result in that aforementioned 6-month delay to the market. For comparison, AMD has already been putting out its own Ryzen 4000 chips based on 7-nanometer architecture for months, which have been handily outperforming Intel's offering. So actually, I was wrong. That Ryzen 4000 chips are already out. So let's actually take a quick look at what's the difference between 10 nanometer, 7-nanometer. Does it really make a difference? This is a relatively old article in the computer dates, but this is from Semiconductor Engineering from 2016, where it talks about 10 nanometer versus 7 nanometer. Not going to read through the whole thing. I have some highlighted points. It says, and this is actually kind of funny. It says, meanwhile, Intel will move into 10 nanometer production by mid-2017 with 7 nanometer slated for 2018 or 2019. In addition, global foundries will also be in the mix at 7 nanometer. So this is hilarious because basically Intel is only releasing 10 nanometer. It's not even out yet. So this is the list of CPU architectures from Intel Wiki, and it says that Alder Lake, which is 10 nanometer, is going to be, no, my mistake, Tiger Lake is only coming out at the end of this year. This is 10 nanometer from Intel, and it's not even out yet. So this is way back in 2016. They were planning mid-2017 10 nanometer production. They haven't even got that out yet. This is hilariously bad. So we can talk, I think I highlighted something else. If not, yeah. So what is 7 nanometer? Like 10 nanometer, 7 nanometer has some pluses and minuses compared to 16, 14. 7 nanometer provides a 35% speed improvement, 65% less power, and 3.3x density improvement according to Gartner. 7 nanometer brings a lot of larger economic benefits, he says. In most cases, that outweighs the design cost you have to spend. There are power advantages as well as longer battery life. So this is suggesting, at least at the time, they were predicting 7 nanometer compared to 16 and 14 nanometer, not 10, keep in mind, is a 35% improvement, 65% less power, more density. And so on the wiki, there were some also interesting points. This is the 10 nanometer process is what it's called. It says, since 2009, however, node is the term a lot of companies are using, like the 10 nanometer node, whatever, as referring to the process. However, this is interesting to me. It says, since 2009, node has become a commercial name for marketing purposes that indicates new generations of process technologies without relation to gate length, metal pitch, or gate pitch. So basically, it's saying that this whole thing about, 10 nanometer, 7 nanometer CPUs is not actually referring exactly to the size of the transistor. It's just kind of like referring to the generation in general, which is kind of funny. So just because it's a 7 nanometer doesn't mean it's exactly 7 nanometer. And I believe up here, yeah, it says 10 nanometer class denotes chips made using a process for technologies between 10 and 20. So I mean, it's referring to the generation of chips, but it doesn't exactly mean that one is exactly 7 nanometer or not. And it says, so for example, GlobalFoundries' 7 nanometer process is similar to Intel's 10 nanometer process. Thus, the conventional notion of a process node has become blurred. So you kind of have to do some research. Just because one is a 7 nanometer CPU, one's a 10 nanometer, doesn't necessarily mean that one is going to be 100% better than the other. But I mean, considering that Intel's a year behind in the generation, it probably will be. TSMC and Samsung's 10 nanometer processors. TSMC, by the way, is a Taiwanese chip manufacturer, I believe. Their 10 nanometer processors are somewhere between Intel's 14 and 10 nanometer processors in transistor density. So when Intel actually puts out 10 nanometer, then it's actually going to be slightly better than these 10 nanometer processors, it seems like, in terms of transistor density. And it also points out the transistor density, number of transistors per square millimeter, is more important than transistor size, since smaller transistors no longer necessarily mean improved performance or increase the number of transistors. So density is more important. So again, there's a lot of factors, but probably in general, you know, as they decrease the size of the transistors, you're probably going to get better density anyway. Now we can move on to the wiki, briefly talking about 7 nanometer. And it says, in semiconductor manufacturing, the internal roadmap defines the 7 nanometer process. Here's another point where I was talking about, same thing. It defines the 7 nanometer process as the MOSFET technology node following the 10 nanometer node. So it's defined not by its size, but just the generation. It's so stupid. And it says it's based on FinFET transistor technology, a type of MOSFET. I've never personally heard of FinFET before. I'm not super well read in all this. I have heard of MOSFET from my physics minor degree days. But yeah, so basically it's just a type of transistor. And the 7 nanometer, 10 nanometer these days apparently just refers to the generation and probably roughly to the size. Now, another funny thing is, after this was all announced that Intel would be delaying all this, the Intel stock just got absolutely annihilated. So right now, it's down about 15%, you can see, while AMD stock is up about 10% or 11%. So obviously, this is excellent news for AMD, who's already putting out 7 nanometer stuff, while Intel is like years behind. This is really, really bad for Intel. So I think I highlighted some more stuff. I'm going to more look in detail at the Tom's Hardware article. It's a lot better. The title of this article from Tom's Hardware is Intel's 7 nanometer is broken. Company announces delays until 2022, 2023. So we're not going to, again, read through necessarily the entire thing, but most of it. Intel announced today its Q2 2020 earnings release that has now delayed the rollout of 7 nanometer processors by 6 months relative. We already read this. Undoubtedly resulting in wide-ranging delays in the company's roadmaps. Intel's press release also says that yields for its 7 nanometer process are now 12 months behind the company's internal targets, meaning the company isn't currently on track to produce its 7 nanometer process in an economically viable way. The company now says its 7 nanometer CPUs will not debut on the market until late 2022 or 2023. When it's talking about the yield, from my understanding, what happens when you make a CPU, they basically produce these big wafers and they just kind of chop off individual CPUs off this. So you don't produce one CPU at a time, you produce these big wafers, and this might have hundreds of them on there. And the yield, I believe, is how much usable CPUs can come off of a wafer. So basically, this is suggesting that they are not even ready necessarily to produce the 7 nanometer processors. And when they will be, they're not going to be able to produce enough consistently to even be worth it economically to make them. So they're even doubly behind. So this is basically the same thing. The primary driver of this delay apparently is the yield of 7 nanometer process, which is, based on recent data, is now trending approximately 12 months behind the company's internal target. We already read about this defect mode, they say, and it says, as a result, Intel has invested in contingency plans, which Swan says later defined as including using third-party foundries. So apparently they're going to kind of try and pick up some slack using third-party. I don't know about competitors, but whatever. Company will also use external third-party foundries for its forthcoming 7-nanometer Ponte Vecchio, I don't know if that's pronounced right, GPUs, the company's first graphics chips. So it says these GPUs will come in late 2021 or early 2022. Intel's first 7-nanometer server CPUs, Granite Rapids, will arrive in 2023, which is later than the listed in earlier roadmaps that projected a launch in 2022. The timeline is concerning in the face of AMD's continued executions with its EPYC data center CPUs. AMD's roadmap outlines its 5-nanometer Genoa, I don't know if that's right, processors coming to the market before the end of 2022. So AMD is already saying that they're going to be having their 5-nanometer CPUs out basically at the same time Intel is just getting the ball rolling on 7-nanometer. Again, it's just looking worse and worse for Intel. Swan, CEO, also said that Intel's first 7-nanometer processors will debut for the client market, meaning chips targeting either desktop or PCs, laptops. The first 7-nanometer processors will debut, and Intel's first 10-nanometer desktop CPUs, Alder Lake, will arrive in the second half of 2021. So again, they're not even releasing the 10-nanometer yet. This is like pathetic. For perspective, rival foundries TSMC plans it will be on 3-nanometer node in the same timeframes as Intel's new schedule for 7-nanometer. My God, this is horrible. This is what happens. I believe this is because Intel got lazy. They were the market leader for so long, and I think they just got lazy. And, you know, they weren't competing as well. They thought they had it in the bag. And then AMD, these other manufacturers, come out of nowhere and just annihilate them, and now Intel has to play serious catch-up. Intel clearly isn't pleased with its execution on the 7-nanometer node. As embattled, Swan remarked that, and we feel pretty good about where we are, though. We feel pretty good about where we are, though we're not happy. That seems like very contradictory statement. I'm not pleased with the 7-nanometer process performance. At the end of the call, after a bruising question and answer session with analysts, Swan also said, we have root caused the 7-nanometer issue and believe there are no fundamental roadblocks, and the company will provide further updates on upcoming architecture day. So it seems like they at least figured out what the problem is, but now they got to solve it. Swan said the company had built-in buffer in its roadmap to account for process node delays. Apparently not big enough. The accommodation comes from a result of hard-learned lessons from the company's incessant 10-nanometer delays. Really hard-learned? I don't know about that. It seems like they haven't really learned anything if they're delayed this much again. Intel says it will use advanced packaging technologies, which include a mix-and-match components produced from external sources with its own chips, to help reconcile the 6-month delay to its 7-nanometer processes with the year-long delay in internal yield projections. In the past, Intel stated it would also enable newer architectures to be portable to older nodes. It's plausible Intel could resort to backporting some architectures. I don't know what that means, blah, blah, blah. Intel, the 7-nanometer delay reflects yet another struggle for Intel to overcome the multi-year yield issues it encountered with the 10-nanometer process. Yeah, we know all that. And here's another good point. Apple also recently announced that it's transitioning from Intel's chips to its own ARM-based 7-nanometer silicon. I bet that a big part of Apple deciding to switch to making its own CPUs for its hardware is probably because of this delay. Apple was probably like, you know what? We already know how to do this. We've been doing it for the iPhone, for making our own CPUs, I mean. Why are we waiting on Intel, who's slogging it, not even getting competition right? Apple probably decided based on this huge delay. They probably knew ahead of time. And I would not be surprised. Apple's probably not going to say it, but yeah, they are probably like, yeah, screw Intel. We're just going to do it ourselves. These guys suck. In my own words. I'm not saying Apple said that. The 7-nanometer delay also exacerbates the recent news that Rockstar chip architect Jim Keller, who was a key part of the team to revitalize the company's roadmaps, has left the company. Intel CFO George Davis has so this is going back. Apparently this is like historically what happened. The Intel CFO George Davis has previously indicated that the company's process tech would lag in its competitors until 7 nanometer arrived in 2021, and the company would regain the lead with its 5 nanometer process at an undefined time. So they were like, back when the 10 nanometer delays were happening, I guess they're like, oh yeah, we'll catch up with 7 nanometer. Yeah, right. So this is what he had said at the time. So we bring a lot of capability to the table for our processors. In addition to the CPU, we feel we're in starting to see an acceleration, blah, 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 a lot of marketing speak, and we know they're wrong. The plan to regain a competitive footing has now obviously shifted due to the 7 nanometer delay. Intel had planned to speed the delivery of 7 nanometer mode. Oh my gosh, tongue twister, 7 nanometer. How many times can I say that fast? Due to the offset of underperforming its 10 nanometer, which it says would not perform as well as other nodes. Oh my God. At the time, Davis noted that the company was trying to be clear with investors about the impacts of the 10 nanometer and the company's gross margins, but the fact that he wanted to be clear, talking about the generation, blah, blah, blah. So let's try to get some actual substance here instead of marketing talk. All right, we'll just skip to what I highlighted. Today, Intel said that it plans to increase its shipments of 10 nanometer chips by 20% over its prior projections. So it appears the company's 10 nanometer chips have shifted out of necessity. So they're like, yeah, we kind of have to increase production since we're going to be delayed on this other stuff. Intel's new plan centers on gaining another full node of performance from its current 10 nanometer node, meaning 10 nanometer may have longer legs than the company expected when it announced last year that it would accelerate 7 nanometer production. Intel pulled off a similar feat with its 14 nanometer processors through a series of plus revisions that added incremental performance improvements. So it does have a track record of successful internode improvements that could help it maintain its competitiveness until it can correct the issues with the 7 nanometer process. So it seems like they're going to at least try to get a full generation of performance increases out of 10 nanometer before the 7 nanometer even comes out. This is what they're saying. They're basically saying, oh yeah, we're going to basically be able to get 7 nanometer performance out of it. Just trust us. I mean, I'm not holding my breath. Intel also traditionally used third-party fabs, currently to the tune of 20% of its production for low-margin non-CPU products on trailing edge nodes. Intel's new plans to more aggressively leverage external fabs could result in using other fabs for core logic like CPUs and GPUs when the company hasn't done in the past. It seems like this is that contingency plan they were talking about. They might just have to, go to competitors to produce the CPUs they can't. As Swan noted, that will present challenges in maintaining attractive ASPs for Intel's products, especially given the scale of its production needs. Ultimately, Intel could face significantly reduced margins if it outsources significant portions of its fabrications of higher margin products like CPUs to third parties. Relying on outside vendors for leading edge node production also incurs more risk in terms of supply assurance, as Intel could be forced to compete with deep-pocketed rival semiconductor companies like Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and others for production capacity. So it's like, yeah, they're going to rely on these other companies, and meanwhile, they're going to get outbid. And another good point that I was reading somewhere was saying how basically a lot of the manufacturers, pre-made computer manufacturers, a lot of them use Intel for like laptops and stuff. If they're going to be falling behind this much, AMD might start to pick up some of that market share, and it'll just kind of accelerate. And I feel like if OEM computer manufacturers start switching to AMD, then Intel might not be able to get that back. So this is really horrible, horrible news for Intel, I think. I have investments in both Intel, AMD, and like Nvidia, Apple, all that. And so I'm not really biased here, but this is just really bad for Intel. It sucks. I don't know. For my next computer, usually I just kind of stick with Intel, but I haven't built a computer in like 5 years. But I always just kind of assumed, yeah, AMD is finally coming up, but I don't know, Intel seems to still be the best one. Now, I think it's pretty clear AMD is leading the charge, and I think when I do next build a computer, it'll probably be an AMD computer. I'm thinking it's looking like the obvious choice here, and they're cheaper, better performance. Yeah, I'm thinking AMD is probably the way to go for a while. So yeah, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. There's not much more to say about it for what I think, but yeah, it's just overall bad news for Intel. We'll see. Hopefully this is just going to increased competition. I think it's going to be a few years before Intel catches up, but we'll have to see if they can pull it off. And we'll just have to hope that AMD doesn't go the way of Intel and eventually get lazy and start raising prices ridiculously and saying, oh, well, now we're in the lead, we're going to slow down. I don't know. AMD doesn't seem like they've been doing that, so we'll have to see. So let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video, guys.